All right, so here we are. We're back again, South Beach Gospel Ministries, and today is a special teaching because we're going to be talking about an event that will be commemorated tonight at sundown in the Jewish faith, TISHA B'AV, or the 5th month and 9th day of the Jewish calendar. TISHA B'AV is a day that lives in infamy in Judaism and in Jewish belief. Why? Because the first and second temples of God were destroyed on that very same day. And the reason why we're talking about it, again, it starts at sundown tonight and will last until sundown tomorrow. And so what we are going to be looking at is the prophetic references in Scripture to the temple, the significance of the destruction of the temples, and what the Bible tells us about the rebuilding of a third temple that is even now, as we speak, in the process of being performed. The ashes of the red heifer were created a couple of weeks ago when the red heifer ceremony was instituted in the land of Israel. And for 2,000 years, not having a temple hasn't been the primary problem for the nation of Israel, because with modern day architecture, you could build a temple in less than 6 months. What they didn't have until just recently was the red heifer that was required to be able to use the ashes thereof to sanctify the temple. And because of an evangelical Christian cattle rancher in Texas, he was able, after 2,000 years of not having a red heifer anywhere in the world, all of a sudden this cattle rancher from Texas was able to generate 8 different calves that had all red hair with no white hairs, which makes them ritualistically acceptable for the temple sacrifice where you burn them and take the ashes. So that has been accomplished only within the last couple of years, and a couple of weeks ago that very ceremony occurred. And in case you say, well, we don't have a temple yet, you can't have a red heifer ceremony. No, all you would need is the altar. So we're going to be looking at TISHA B'AV, the significance of that throughout history, and why that ties in directly to Bible prophecy. And last week we had talked about the rapture and whether or not it would happen on September 23rd, the Feast of Trumpets, or Yom Teruah of 2025, which is just a few weeks away. Here we are, second day of August, and we see September right around the corner. We came to the conclusion that you cannot say with absolute certainty the day and the hour of the rapture, but we certainly can see the season of the rapture, and the rebuilding of the temple is absolutely necessary to the completion of that entire period of time known as the 70th week of Daniel, that 7-year period of time when the church will have been gone, Antichrist can be revealed, the 7-year covenant of peace can be confirmed only after the church is gone in the pre-tribulation rapture. And during that time, it is believed that this will be the piece of international law legislation that will allow for the rebuilding of the temple. As I said, is already underway in terms of planning. They already have street signs up pointing to a temple that doesn't exist. They already have the implements necessary for the temple in place. Why is all this going on? Because at any minute the rapture could occur, and when that happens, you're going to have that covenant of peace confirmed, Antichrist will be revealed, and we're going to find out that there's absolutely a necessary condition precedent to the completion of the 70th week of Daniel. That's going to be the rebuilding of yet a third temple. In fact, we won't have time to look at it in detail, but if you look at the book of Daniel, you'll see that it makes reference to an abomination of desolation. Jesus makes mention of that as well. Ezekiel, by the way, we know Ezekiel 37, the dry bones prophecy, Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog-Magog war. We talked about that in recent weeks, and how the 12-day Iran-Israel war could be a precursor to the Gog-Magog war. But what people don't talk about is Ezekiel chapter 40 all the way through to 48. You don't really hear too much talk about that. The reason for that is it lays out basically the architectural plans for a yet unbuilt temple. What temple is that? It's not the first temple, the Temple of Solomon. It's not the second temple, which is the temple of sometimes it's referred to as Zerubbabel's temple, sometimes it's referred to as Herod's temple, because Herod, who was the ruler, the governor at the time that the second temple was being rebuilt, he donated a lot of money to curry favor with the Jewish people to have the temple rebuilt and refurbished and all of that. So sometimes the second temple will be called Zerubbabel's temple, or it'll be called Herod's temple. It's talking about the same thing. It's the temple that stood at the time of Jesus. What is the significance of the temple and these temples? Well, that Ezekiel chapter 30, 40 through 48 gives you the plans for what I believe is a yet fourth temple. So I think we're going to have 4 temples in Scripture that are based upon the face of the planet Earth, in the city of Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, and then of course in eternity we'll find that there is no need for the temple, because God himself will be there and the Lord Jesus Christ will be there, and we will interact with them directly. But until that time, we've already had 2 temples and we got 2 more to go, and we're going to be talking about that. So again, what's TISHA B'AV? That's the Hebrew way of saying the 9th day of the Hebrew month Av, which is the 5th month of the Jewish calendar. And what we're going to find out then is that on the 9th of Av in 586 BC, that is to say almost 6 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Temple of Solomon was destroyed. Why? Because Israel had not given the land her Sabbath's rest. Remember, we talked about the 70 weeks of Daniel, Daniel chapter 9. Most amazing prophecy in the Bible is the 69 weeks of Daniel, which is Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 through Daniel chapter 9 verse 26, which gives you that 69 weeks of years that predicted 483 years in advance to the very day that Jesus would ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Nisan 1032 AD, to present himself as the Passover lamb. 4 days later, he's crucified, consistent with Exodus chapter 12 and Exodus chapter 13. And then we find out that there's a gap between Daniel chapter 9 verses 24 to 26 and Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, which is that 70th week, or that last week of years. You had the first 69 weeks of years, or 483 years. You have that last week of years. That last 7 years completes the entire 490-year prophetic passageway that we have laid out for us in Daniel chapter 9 verses 24 through 27. And again, we talked about the rapture and why we think 2025, though we can't know the day or the hour, is probably the best bet ever in the history of the church, the 2,000-year history of the church. Why? Because of those verses in the Old Testament that says, and we talked about that a few weeks back, the millennial week of human history. Remember how we learned that in Psalm chapter 90, verse 4, and in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, I believe it is, that God sees a day as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. So when we see strange prophetic passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament that say things like, after 2 days he will revive us, and the 3rd day he will lift us up and we will dwell in his sight. Is that talking about 24-hour period of time? Or is that Bible prophecy's way of saying that after 2,000 years, the people that have believed in the Lord will be raised up, and then for another 1,000 years, we're going to dwell in the sight of the Lord? That's exactly the pre-tribulation rapture, dispensational theology, and Bible prophecy, eschatology, which was consistent with what we learned when we looked at the New Testament. There was another passage in Matthew, and it's also repeated, I believe, in Luke, that talks about Jesus being transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration. Everybody remembers that. Jesus went up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and he turned, really bright, and then Moses and Elijah showed up, and Peter was there along with 2 other disciples, and Peter said, "Hey, do you want us to build booths for you and for Elijah and for Abraham?" It was actually Abraham and Elijah, I believe. And should we build booths for them? And Jesus was transfigured, and then God said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." But if you look at that passage, it says, now after 2 days, Jesus ascended, the Mount of Transfiguration was transfigured. Some Bible prophecy scholars have suggested that this is a hint that after a 2,000-year period of time, that Jesus will be glorified in the sight of men. And what is that talking about? Well, it turns out that the church is now 2 days old. That is to say, 2,000 years old, but 2 days in God's eyes. So is that Old Testament passage that says After 2 days, he will revive us, and the third day he will dwell in our sight, combined with Jesus saying, the Bible saying after 2 days, Jesus went up to the Mount of Transfiguration and was, glorified in the sight of both Old Testament saints and New Testament saints. Is that saying that after a 2,000-year period of time, which we now know as the church age, that church age would end after 2 days or 2,000 years, and then there would come another day, the millennial day of Sabbath rest. There remains therefore a Sabbath day's rest, but only for the people of the Lord. Is that a way of saying that now that the church is 2,000 years old, that our time is over? Passing out gospel tracts and doing that, all that comes to an end. It doesn't continue out into foreverness. And then the 70th week begins, and then you have that period of time when the temple is rebuilt, Antichrist goes into it, commits the abomination of desolation, and you can complete the 70th week of Daniel with the second coming of Christ at the conclusion of that 70th week, and then you have that Sabbath day's rest of a 1,000-year reign where Jesus is actually on the earth as God in human flesh, dwelling with us, only the people of the Lord though. So, the reason why 2025, again, we're just touching upon that briefly, is a really excellent day or date for this pre-tribulation rapture is that we know that the 69 weeks of Daniel that we did all the math for, and Sir Robert Anderson, mathematician, chief of investigation of Scotland Yard in the 1800s, did all of the investigation, looked at all the calendars, and was able to tell us with absolute certainty that it was on Nisan 10 of 445 BC that Artaxerxes Longimanus gave the decree to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And when you count forward 69 weeks of years, that's that Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 26, the 69 weeks of years of that total 70 years prophetic passage was fulfilled on Nisan 10 of 32 AD. 4 days later, Jesus is crucified, and he's raised from the dead on the Feast of First Fruits. 50 days after the Passover, which was the time when Jesus was crucified, you have Pentecost, which is the birthday of the church. That was 2,000 years ago. The church is 2,000 years old. Because of that, you have now a set piece, 32 AD. So if you count it forward 2,000 years from 32 AD, that would place you at what? 2032 AD for the completion of the 70 weeks of Daniel prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. That period of time requires a 2,000-year period of the church era. That would end in 2032 AD, which would be when Jesus comes back at Armageddon to the Mount of Olives. And that's where Armageddon occurs, and that's when the millennium will begin. But because there needs to be a 70th week of Daniel, or a 7-year period of time, you would have to subtract 7 years from the 32. So from 32 AD, crucifixion and resurrection, to 2032 AD, the second coming and the beginning of the millennium, you would have to subtract out that 70th week of Daniel, that 7-year period of time, which would put you in, if you subtract 7 from 2032, that gives you 2025, which is the year we're in. In fact, August, September, October, November, December, we only have 5 months left in 2025. So we'll know relatively quickly whether or not 2025 was that year because of the 70th week of Daniel running from 32 AD backwards to 2025. So after 2025 AD, that particular Bible prophecy, aesthetic or computation will no longer be valid. So we'll know in 5 months whether or not that's accurate. We can't say with absolute certainty that it'll be on Rosh Hashanah or the Day of the Trumpets, even though the Day of the Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, is the perfect type or picture or shadow of the pre-tribulation rapture, because nobody can know the day or hours. Now, we did have a new subscriber from last week who said, well, even if you did guess that it was Feast of Trumpets, you can't stop God if he had picked it in advance, because then men would stop God's plans. So if we guess the right day, nobody can say with absolute certainty we know the day or the hour. So even if it is on Yom Teruah or the Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, on September 23rd of this year, nobody knows for sure. So it would at best be a guesstimate. So it could happen, because it would only be a guess and nobody knew for sure. We happened to guess right. If you had 365 people and they each picked a different day of the year and the rapture happened that year, somebody would have guessed right if they picked a different day for each 365 days in the year. So the point is, we are at the conclusion, and Yom Teruah That's down the road a piece. But today, in just a few hours when the sun sets, we will begin TISHA B'AV, the 9th of Av. And this is how we know that the Bible is a supernatural book written by God. Because that first temple that God commanded to be built so that his presence could be with the nation of Israel, so the pagan nations would know God is with this special people that he chose and created himself, that was destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the leader of the Babylonian Empire. But it was by the will of God. God put it in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar to punish Israel for robbing the land of its 70 years worth of rest. Every 7th year, Israel was supposed to rest the land, and in the 6th year, God would give twice a double abundance of the agricultural crop for that year, so that they would have enough to eat through the 7th year when they didn't do any growing. And we now know from agricultural scientists, whether it be at Michigan State University has a great ag science school, Texas A&M has some of the best ag scientists in the world. Agricultural science tells us that if you rest the soil, it can replenish itself. But if you grow the soil and you don't rest it, you will eventually turn it into sand. And, it'll be leached of all the nutrients and it won't be valuable anymore. So we now know that farmers will sometimes break up their land into quadrants and grow 3 and rest 1. And then the next year they'll rotate and rest the next quadrant and grow the other 3. Why? Because God's smarter than we are, and he was telling us advanced agricultural science before we actually knew anything. But what Israel did over the course of 490 years, that's 10 years short of 500 years, they cheated the land. Why? Because they had lack of faith in God. Well, God has been giving us a double harvest on the 6th year, but you know what? We built a bunch of big barns. It'll be even better if we went ahead and grew those and stored them up in storehouses. We wouldn't have to trust in the Lord. Not that he won't do it, but just in case he forgets, we'll be able to do it ourselves. So it showed a lack of faithfulness in the God of Israel. And so God wasn't saying that he loved the land more than he loved the people of Israel. He was saying that he didn't like it when they didn't trust him, and when he provided for them, he had proven himself reliable. And so that was the whole idea. And we know that from Jeremiah chapter 25 and Jeremiah chapter 29, that was the real reason for the Babylonian captivity. God put it in the hearts of the king of Babylon to go to Israel and take those people captive and tell them to submit to the authority of this pagan king as punishment to give the land her 70 years rest. So if you divided 7 into 490 years, which was the period of time that Israel cheated the land out of its rest, you'd come up with, you owe them 70 years. So Israel owed God 70 years to rest the land. And so what God did is took them out of the land so they couldn't grow the crops, but only for 70 years. And so when that happened, some of the priests said, well, no, we're going to preach prosperity, and if we pray and whatever, we're going to be able to prevail against the king of Babylon. So God told them to submit to the king of Babylon, because this was discipline. When you are a parent, what do? You discipline your kids, right? God help the fool who tries to punish or discipline somebody else's kid, but God owns the nation of Israel. He created the people out of the womb of a Chaldean woman who had been infertile all her life, and at the age of 95 she magically got pregnant because God made it happen. Her husband was over 100 years old, Abram, another Chaldean man, and because God was faithful, he caused that supernatural pregnancy to occur, which was the birth of Isaac, the very first Jewish person. And so Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and out of the tribe of Judah came King David, who was a type or shadow, a picture of the Messiah, and eventually came Jesus, who became the Messiah. And so we see God was faithful to his people, but as a good parent, when children act up or act out or are disobedient, they have to be disciplined. So God used Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, to discipline Israel and give the land her 70 years rest. But the priest said, nah, that's not what God is doing. The prophets are wrong. We're going to continue to do what we want to do. Because the theological system generates money and stuff. I don't want to say that it was a precursor to the prosperity false gospel that you see on evangelical Christian TV nowadays, but I think it probably was something like that. And there was all kinds of abominations going on. Remember how Jeremiah had decried the fact that Israel had adopted the pagan activities of some of the surrounding nations, including doing the worship of Semiramis and Nimrod, the baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven, which was Semiramis, the fertility sky goddess of the ancient Babylon, and also the men in the temple, including the priests, turning their backs to the altar and facing the sun to the east. So they would look at the sun like I'm doing right now. The sun is rising over the Atlantic Ocean on Miami Beach, and I'm looking at it, and they would raise their hands, turn their back to the altar, and look at the sun and worship it. Even the priests were doing that. And so when God showed Jeremiah that, he said, man, he's really mad with them because they're doing pagan practices in the temple. And so what God eventually had to do was send Nebuchadnezzar back, not only to take and deport some of the survivors of their attack on Israel, but to destroy the temple, raze it to the ground, to stop them from putting the temple, which is a building, as an idol above their involvement with God himself. God says, I don't desire sacrifice of blood, the blood of bulls and goats. I want obedience. When I tell you to do something, that's what I want you to do. I don't want you to worship a building. I don't want you to worship a religious practice. I want you to obey me. And so the temple was destroyed by God through Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC on the 9th day of Av. The 9th of Av, also known as TISHA B'AV. And so when we fast forward down the quarter of time, we'll see that Jesus had predicted that this temple that got rebuilt later, remember God ended the Babylonian Empire, and after using them to help discipline Israel for the 70 years, Daniel found out that Jeremiah said, oh, it's only going to be 70 years captivity and then we get to go back. And God replaced the Babylonians with the Persian Empire. Media-Persia allowed Israel to go back and rebuild the temple. And so there was a temple standing when Jesus was there. But Jesus, during his last week of his ministry, he gave that famous Bible prophecy seminar, Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse, and he said, do you see these stones of the temple? Because, the disciples were so impressed. Man, look at the temple, it's so glorious. Jesus said, not one stone will stand upon another that will not be cast down, because the people of Israel did not know the time of their visitation, that the Messiah had come in the conclusion of the 69 weeks of Daniel, which was predicted 483 years in advance to the day. They were expected to know that day, and because they didn't, the temple would be destroyed. It wasn't destroyed that day, but some 38 years later, it was. On 70 AD, Titus Vespasian, who was then a general with the Roman army that had, replaced, and we're going to go through the 4 world empires that were revealed to Daniel in the book of Daniel: head of gold, Babylon; chest of silver, and Media-Persia; hips of brass, which is the Grecian Empire; and legs of iron, which was the Roman Empire. And the revived Roman Empire, by the way, are the feet, which was iron mixed with miry clay. That suggests maybe a Nephilim hybrid human entity will make up the revived Roman Empire of the Antichrist. But it was the Roman Empire that came along and destroyed the temple. And guess when they did it? 70 AD, 38 years after Jesus predicted. But guess what day they did it? They did it on, newsflash, the 9th day of what month? The month of Av, TISHA B'AV, 9th day of Av, more than 600 years apart. The destruction of the first temple of God and the second temple of God. That shows you that it wasn't the efforts of a man that caused the destruction. It wasn't just anti-Semitism. It was God manipulating space-time and history to have his perfect will done. Why? Because, again, just like with the first temple, Israel had made the second temple, and the practices therein, doing the sacrifice of bulls and goats and, money changing in the temple. It became a big money-making thing to have religion and theology in Israel, and the priests were becoming corrupt. And so what Jesus did is warn them that God is going to have to do the same thing he did the first time, destroy the temple, to take away from Israel an idol that they could worship instead of God. Instead of being obedient to God, they could be obedient to the priests and a bunch of theological, ecclesiastical, religious practices that substituted for a personal relationship with the God of Israel. And so that day occurred. And we know that it was a supernatural occurrence because Nebuchadnezzar was long dead by the time the Roman Empire even came to be. So Titus Vespasian, who went on to become an emperor of Rome, was just a general at the time. And the goal was to make the temple of God in Jerusalem a perfect, brand new Parthenon, or, resting place or a temple of the pagan gods of Rome. They had already put a statue of Jupiter in the temple, which offended the priests and offended the people of Israel. They were going to make it the perfect set piece. So they would have like the Parthenon in Greece or the Pantheon in Rome. You would have your very own Roman temple in the city of Jerusalem. They would convert the Jewish temple into a Roman temple. So they wanted to keep it and preserve it and fill it with pagan idols. But God caused one of the fire-tipped arrows of one of the soldiers when they were putting down the revolt. The priests and some of the zealots said, oh, we're not going to allow you to come and desecrate our temple. So they fought. And so eventually the Bar Kokhba rebellion went on all the way to 135 BC, where they fought against the Romans. But in 70 AD, one of the Roman soldiers who were fighting back against the people who were in the temple trying to prevent the Romans from desecrating it, the arrow went errant, went through a window and hit a drape. So you had these velvet drapes in the temple that caught on fire. And you had the walls of the temple that were basically covered with pure gold sheeting. So a thin metal sheet. We know that metal is the most precious of all, gold is the most precious of all metals, the most pure, but also the softest, most malleable. When I got my law school ring from Georgetown, they said, don't get it in 14 karat gold, because in a few years, it's going to get so beaten up because 14 karat gold is too soft, you won't be able to see your school logo or any of those things. Get 10 karat gold. It's not as shiny, but it has less gold in it, and it'll last longer. And sure enough, it's lasted to this very day. So we know that the more gold in the metal, the softer it is. So what happened is when the drapes caught on fire, the gold plating in the walls of the temple that were over the cedar trees, remember the cedars of Lebanon, where the superstructure upon which the temple was built, and then the walls were sheeted with gold, those gold sheets melted. And so you had tens of millions of dollars in gold melting and running down. Now that the drapes caught on fire, the cedar trees, which were the superstructure of the temple, caught on fire, and it melted the gold. Tens of millions of dollars of gold went down as almost like melting wax. You pour water on a floor, it goes down into the cracks. So the Romans and the centurions had an obligation, because there were tens of millions of dollars in gold down in the foundation cracks, the foundation stones of the temple. They had to take the temple apart stone by stone. Why? To be mean to the Jews, or because they were being anti-Semitic? No, because they wanted to get to tens of millions of dollars of gold that God supernaturally caused to melt and run down into the cracks, to give the Romans an incentive to go and do what he wanted them to do all along, which was to destroy the temple and take it apart stone by stone, to fulfill Jesus' prophecy in Matthew chapter 24 to the word by doing that. They didn't do it on purpose. Rome was being manipulated by God, the same way that Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar were being manipulated by God to serve a greater eternal purpose that they had no idea of. And so that also occurred on the 9th day of Av. And then you fast forward 65 years later to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when it was finally put down. They had Israel had picked their own Shimon Bar Kokhba, son of the star. He was considered the Messiah. He was the replacement for Jesus. He was a guy that they chose to throw their lot behind. He fought valiantly, and they ended their battle on Mount Masada, which was a Roman fortress outside Jerusalem to the south. And eventually, rather than submit to the Romans, who built a rampart to go up and capture them, they killed themselves. They self-deleted. But before that occurred, we have the actual defeat of these people on what day? It was on the 9th day of Av. So we see again, the Bar Kokhba revolt was overcome and defeated on the 9th of Av. That wasn't planned by the Jews. That wasn't planned by the Romans. That was planned by God himself to send us a message that once Jesus came as the Messiah, the temple was replaced as the repository of the blood of bulls and lambs and goats to atone for sin on a yearly basis. Now God took the temple away to force them to come to the conclusion that it was going to be either Jesus the Messiah, who's the Passover lamb for all time, or no Passover lamb's going to be sacrificed, and they haven't been able to sacrifice any Passover lambs for 2,000 years now. And so God was doing that for Israel. So we see already, TISHA B'AV is a reminder that the church's time is over. the show for the church has ended. I passed out some gospel tracts today, and I'm like, man, I'm really tired. I wanted to sleep in. It's hot out here. It's been the hottest summer ever, everywhere in the world. I don't know. People are talking about, programmed weather and all kinds of stuff, signs of the end times. But it's been super hot. But I keep reminding myself, oh man, the church age is over. And so I don't know how many more Saturdays I get to come out here and pass out gospel tracts and talk to you guys on YouTube about Bible prophecy and things of that nature. So man, whether it's hot or not, I better get out here and do it, because this might be the last one. The church's age is over, and God is now shifting his focus back to where it began, with the nation of Israel. And so the destruction of the temple is a reminder of that thing. That destruction of both those temples was not for the church's benefit, not for the Gentile believers, but for the benefit of the nation of Israel. And we're going to see that another temple is going to have to be rebuilt, and it's in the process of being rebuilt. The plans are already in place. The red heifer has already been sacrificed 2 weeks ago, and some people have said, oh, well, no, it was a practice. They are saying that, some have suggested, for political reasons, because they don't want the Muslim community surrounding the Temple Mount to go bananas. And it's like, oh my gosh, if they're doing sacrifices on the Temple Mount, on some ready-made altar, that means they're about to rebuild the temple. World War III will come. And that eventually is what's going to have to happen. And probably it's going to take that 7-year peace treaty with the Antichrist to allow for the rebuilding of that Jewish temple. So the rebuilding of the temple, the burning of the ashes of the red heifer 2 weeks ago, that is all a sign that God is about to shift his focus away from the Gentile-dominated church. Why? Because we're going home. We served our time. We put 2,000 years or 2 days of work in. And now, the people that did the most work, they're going to get the most rewards at the Bema Seat judgment immediately after. Everybody's getting judged. It's just when and where. The church is going to get judged at the Bema Seat for the work they did for the Lord after getting saved. And for those that did a lot, they're going to get a lot of rewards. For those that didn't do a lot, they're not going to get a lot. And some aren't going to get any because they didn't do anything other than get saved. But they'll still be saved. But the Bema Seat is coming, which means that on the earth, the focus will now shift completely back to Israel. 144,000 Jewish virgins, each from the 12 tribes of Israel, will replace the church as the evangelists of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The difficulty is that now, salvation by grace through faith alone will have ended for all time. Amnesty, get out of hell free, will be over the second the rapture occurs. Why? Because the mark of the beast system will be introduced by the Antichrist, and we already talked about how artificial intelligence and quantum computing and sentience and artificial general intelligence is already giving us the technology that will be necessary. The surveillance networks we have, Starlink and all of these things where you can use satellites to, observe where everybody goes, everything they do on social media. All that's already in place to have the mark of the beast system turned on today if it was necessary, but it's being withheld. Why? By the presence of the church on the earth. That's why Antichrist can't be presented. And so God's going to remove that so we can get that 70th week of Daniel running, and we can fulfill the final prophecies and finally get it ended with the second coming of Christ and the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ. So we're going to look at, we now know that the church age is drawing to a close. The focus is going back to the nation of Israel. TISHA B'AV is a very important part of God trying to remind Israel that these things occurred because he wanted them to occur. Also occurring on the 9th day of Av. Guess what? When the Spaniards, anti-Semitism in Spain, all the Jews were kicked out of Spain during what? The 14th century? On what day? The 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, the 9th of Av. Jews were exported or expelled from the Spanish Empire, from Spain, by the king and queen of Spain because of anti-Semitism. That happened in, again, 14th, 15th century. Then we fast forward to what? 16th century? Great Britain replaces Spain. God judges Spain for anti-Semitism, kicking all the Jews out of Spain. Ends their empire, which is at the time the world's greatest empire because they have the greatest navy in the world, and they get replaced by the British Empire. Now the British Empire has the greatest navy in the history of the world. God judges them for anti-Semitism, and then the British Empire, which is now the greatest empire on earth, does the very same thing in the 16th century, and they kick out all the Jews, and they banish them because of anti-Semitism. And God does what? Well, the British Empire, they used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, I don't know if that's so much true anymore, because the British Empire isn't the greatest empire in the history of the world. In fact, a bunch of Puritans, that Bible-believing Christians, left that very nation to come to a new land called America. Why? Because the Church of England had become corrupt, and they were preventing these Puritan Christians from believing the Bible as the Word of God, and the king would tell you how to believe. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the king would dictate how the church could believe and whether the Bible could be understood as the Word of God or not. And so God put it in the hearts of these Puritans to risk their lives to come over as the Pilgrims, and now we have the United States of America, a bunch of ragtag evangelical Christians that fled from England, that eventually defeated England. Why? Because of the anti-Semitism that occurred during the 9th of Av back in the, I believe it was 16th century, when all of that occurred, and God judged that nation. So God eventually will judge the nations that come against his people, and we know that that is oftentimes God's plan. He'll use pagans and allow them to do evil towards his people, but goodness forbid, when you're disciplining somebody else's kid, that parent is eventually going to come after the people that do the disciplining and destroy them. The Babylonians were judged. The Romans will be judged. The Spaniards were judged. And again, the British will be judged. So we see then that the 9th of Av is the day that all of these terrible things happen throughout Jewish history. And we got to ask ourselves, is that possibly a coincidence? I would suggest to you not. So with the time we have left, I've given you all the background. Let's look at the scriptures real quick, run through them. We're going to look at 8 passages really quickly, and you guys can look at them at your own time. Daniel chapter 1. Verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with part of the vessels of the house of God," that's the temple, "which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." The key transitional phrase here is that it was God that gave the temple of God into the hands of Babylon, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. The king of Israel lost that battle because God wanted him to lose that battle, and he was given into their hands. And so what we see then is that if we jump forward to Daniel chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar, the guy who did the taking over, being made aware of a prophecy related to the end of the world and all the empires that will rise up, all rotating around the importance of the nation of Israel. And so we pick up in Daniel chapter 2, verse 31, the famous metallic man dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And it says, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, Daniel, who is now one of the slaves taken from Israel, has now become an advisor in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And God gave him wisdom to understand the dream of Nebuchadnezzar." And eventually Daniel founded this group of people called the Magi, who were the guys who were looking at the stars. Those are the guys that eventually came to Bethlehem to give gifts to Jesus when he was born, because they saw the stars. They had been taught by Daniel centuries earlier how to look at the signs and be looking for a sign of the birth of a king in the west, which is Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is west, or Bethlehem. Bethlehem is west of Babylon and Persia, and so that the 3 wise men came from out of the east into the west to pay homage to Jesus based upon what's happening here. So Daniel says, "Thou king sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet a part of iron and part of clay. And thou sawest until a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it smote the image and brake them into pieces." So again, we already told you the head of gold, Babylon; chest of silver, Media Persia; hips of brass, Grecian Empire; legs of iron, Roman Empire; the feet that were shattered by the stone, the revived Roman Empire of the Antichrist, made up of humans and non-humans, the Nephilim. How do you know that, Herb? Well, you jump forward a few verses, and in verse 39, Daniel says, "Thou, King Nebuchadnezzar, art the head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and a 3rd kingdom of brass, and a 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron." And then he goes on in verse 41 and says, "Whereas thou sawest the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron. Chuck Missler says if you look at the Aramaic, which is what Daniel 2 was written in, that means earthy clay. It says, for inasmuch as thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay or earthy clay, some have suggested that means human DNA with non-human DNA. Verse 42, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong, partly broken. And verse 43, this is key here. It says, whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, that is, say, earthly clay or maybe human DNA, it says they, personal pronoun there, shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Seed is the biblical term for DNA. So it's saying that some persons who are non-human, Chuck Missler points this out wonderfully in his teaching on Daniel, these are persons because they're referred to by the personal pronoun they. They shall mingle themselves with the DNA, that is to say in Hebrew, zera, of men. The Hebrew word for DNA is zera, translated into English. So they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another. For them to do the mingling, they had, with human DNA, they had to be something other than human. That's a point that you can't contradict that. And it says, in the days of those kings shall God set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And so what we see then is this final revived Roman Empire. And we know it's Roman Empire because Daniel is going to tell us in Daniel chapter 9 that the kingdom of the Antichrist will be a revived form of the Roman Empire. And that during that revived Roman Empire, non-human personages will mingle their genetic material with human DNA to create a super race of hybrid soldiers. That's what we're going to be seeing. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 24, it's going to be just like the days of Noah in the days of the coming of the Son of Man, because the worldwide flood of Noah, we now know, occurred because the Nephilim, hybrid humans, were taking over the planet Earth and breeding human beings, Adamic human DNA, out of existence. That's why the flood had to occur. It's going to be the same way at the conclusion of the 70th week of Daniel. And so, Daniel chapter 9, the most famous prophecy in all the Bible, Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. This is what Gabriel is telling Daniel. 70 weeks, that's 70 weeks of years, boys and girls, not 70 regular weeks of days, but 70 weeks of years, or a total of 490, God bless you, or a total of 490 years, are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish transgression, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So at the end of this 490 prophetic years, the millennial reign of Christ will begin. But the 490 years are divided out into two portions. The first portion, 483 years, when Messiah comes to die as the Passover lamb, separated by a 2,000-year gap called the church era. Then you get the final 70th week, or the final 70 years of that 490 years. That will be the 70th week of Daniel. Antichrist will arise and desecrate the temple. How do you know? Because it says in the next few verses. And then it goes on to say, verse 25, know therefore, and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, Artaxerxes Longimanus gave that decree on Nisan 10 of 445 BC. It says, until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That is to say, 69 weeks of years. And the street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. Verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, that is to say, after the 69 weeks of years, shall Messiah be cut off. That is to say, killed. But not for himself, he's going to die for others. Passover lamb is going to be the sacrifice for the nation of Israel. And the people of the prince that shall come, will be whoever destroys that temple the second time. The Romans were the ones to destroy it the second one, not the Babylonians. So Antichrist will be of the people of the Roman Empire. It says, and the people of the prince that shall come, Antichrist being the prince that shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's the second temple. The temple of Jesus. The temple of Zerubbabel. The temple that stood at the time Jesus had his earthly ministry, also known as Herod's temple. And the end thereof shall be with the flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Now, verse 27. This is where you have the end of the gap. You have a gap of 2,000 years church history between verse 26 and verse 27. Verse 27 is where we pick up with the 70th week of Daniel. And he, who? Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Remember, 1 week, not of days, but 1 week of years. So a 7-year covenant of peace, that's the 70th week, or the final 7 years of the 490-year prophecy, the first 483 of which are already fulfilled when Jesus is crucified. And in the midst of the week, that is to say halfway through the 7 years, he shall cause a sacrifice at the temple and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it what? The temple desolate. So we now know that halfway through the 70th week of Daniel, the tribulation period, we're going to have an abomination of desolation that Daniel talks about. Jesus is going to refer to this in Matthew 24. And so we go on. We'll take a look real quick at Amos. Amos chapter 9, verse 11 says, "In that day I will raise up again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down, and close up the breaches thereof. And I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old." God bless you, sir. Gospel tract. And that is talking about the temple that's going to be destroyed. We know that even the minor prophet Amos predicted that in the last days, the 70th week of Daniel, that God is going to cause the temple to be rebuilt. So it's not rebuilt yet, but we know it's coming because it was predicted in the Bible. Now let's jump forward with the time we have left to the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we're going to take a quick look at Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24 is where, well, let's go ahead and take a look at Matthew chapter 12 first. Jesus says in verse 4, he's talking about the temple and how God got mad because the people are placing emphasis on the temple over and above emphasis on obedience to God. And Jesus is teaching his disciples that Jesus is God in human flesh. He's more important than the temple. And he says, you know, don't you remember, have you not read what David did when he was hungered, that they were with him, how they entered the house of God, the temple, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful to do? Verse 5, "Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple." So Jesus is trying to teach the idea that the temple is not some idol to be worshipped. It's not God himself. It's just a place that God built so that he could temporarily dwell with his people. Then he goes on a few chapters later in Matthew chapter 24, that famous Olivet Discourse. And so Jesus, it starts verse 1, it says, "Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple." They were so impressed with the temple. And Jesus said, "You're impressed with this building?" He says, "Listen, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And we know that that happened when the temple burnt down in 70 AD. The gold ran between the foundation stones, and the Romans had to take it apart stone by stone. God uses time, space, and history to fulfill his will. But then you go on a little bit further in the same Matthew chapter 24 Olivet Discourse, and he talks in verse 15, "When ye shall therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place." What's he talking about? He's talking about Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. The abomination of desolation is a reenactment of the abomination that occurred when the second temple was rebuilt. When Antiochus Epiphanes went into the rebuilt temple and slaughtered a pig, Hanukkah came about because 1 day of holy oil was stretched out into 8 days of holy oil to clean the temple after it had been desecrated, which was a type or a picture of what Antichrist himself would do in the future. And Jesus refers to Daniel, and so we know that Daniel's the writer of the book of Daniel because Jesus said he was. And so he goes on and talks about that. He says, when that happens, flee into the mountains. Clearly, this is making reference now, combined together with Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, to the halfway point in the 70th week of Daniel, 3.5 years after the confirming of that covenant with Antichrist after the pre-tribulation rapture. And it says, for then shall be such great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. And it's going to be shortened to 1,260 days. And if it wasn't, nobody would be left alive on earth. And so Jesus goes on to say a lot of other things, but basically we won't take time to look at those things in Matthew 24 because we've looked at them before. But let's jump forward to John chapter 2. John records Jesus talking about the cleansing of the temple. Again, the temple's important, but it's not God. Verse 12, it says, after this went he down to Capernaum with his mother and his brethren, And verse 13, the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he was found in the temple, those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them out of the temple. And then he turned over the tables, the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the money changers' money, and overthrew the tables. Verse 16, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence. Make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, specifically in Psalm chapter 69, verse 9, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. So Jesus was fulfilling Bible prophecy from way back in the Psalms, written 1,000 years before Jesus, that he would come into the temple and overturn the money changers' table, because money and vice and all kinds of things were mixed up in the temple. And so, verse 18, then the Jews, the religious leaders, said, what sign showest thou us? Seest that thou doest these things? And Jesus answered unto them and said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then the Jews said, 46 years was this temple in the building. In other words, it took 50 years to build it, and you're going to tear it up in 3 days? Verse 21, he says, but he spake of the temple of his body. So we see already that Jesus is already fighting with the religious elite over their veneration of a building, and their veneration, more importantly, of an ability to generate income, money, from selling religion to the people. The last passage we're going to look at here with the time that we're at is going to be 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we're going to complete what Daniel talked about in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, the abomination of desolation that was so important that Jesus mentioned again in Matthew chapter 24. And Paul, who writes this to the Thessalonian church in response to the idea that false believers were saying that the rapture had already occurred and everybody in Thessalonica had been left behind, Paul wrote a letter to calm them down, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, to show them that they hadn't been left behind. And he follows up probably a couple months later in 51 AD with a second letter to the Thessalonian church. And then he starts it, and we looked at this passage last week, chapter 2, verse 1. And Paul says this to the Thessalonian church, now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him. Verse 1 makes reference to the second coming of Christ first, the end of the 70th week of Daniel, and the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ. And then he mentions another coming that's different. That is the rapture of the church that he had talked about earlier in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, when Jesus in John chapter 14, verses 1, 2, and 3 said he's going to come into the clouds and then call us up into the clouds to take us back to his Father's house for the 70th week of Daniel that is occurring on the earth. And so Paul makes reference in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 to both the second coming and the rapture. And then he goes on to say that ye be not soon shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter from us, as if the day of Christ is at hand. In other words, the day of Christ, or the 70th week of Daniel, hasn't already started. And you hear preterists saying that, and you hear all these different pseudo-Christian cultists saying that we're already in the day of the Lord. There is no rapture because we're at the conclusion of the book of Revelation. And so he goes on to say that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he says in verse 3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there coming a falling away first. Falling away, remember we learned the Greek word is apostasia, and that's where we get the word apostasy, which literally means departure. It can be an ideological and rhetorical departure, like departing from a belief that Jesus is God in human flesh to the Jehovah's Witnesses' modern day teaching that Jesus is a created being, the Archangel Michael. That's an apostasy, a departure from what was once believed in the church about Jesus to something apostate that is also about Jesus. But apostasia can also mean a physical departure, going from Miami Beach, Florida to Ann Arbor, Michigan by way of a jetliner for a Michigan football game. That's a physical apostasia or a physical departure. So again, a double entendre is here. We see Jesus making reference to the pre-tribulation rapture and the second coming in verse 1 of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And then we see in verse 3 a reference to apostasy coming into the church first, false teachings in the church will start to predominate, and anytime you turn on evangelical Christian TV and on a bunch of Christian YouTube channels now, you hear all kinds of crazy apostate stuff that totally doesn't agree with Scripture. That's apostasia coming into the church. Before what? The physical departure, not from Miami Beach to Ann Arbor, Michigan, but from the planet Earth to the Father's house in heaven by way of the pre-tribulation rapture. And so we then go on to see in verse 3, he says, that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, apostasy in the church, and then the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, and then that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. That's the Antichrist. He can't be revealed, even though he's probably here on the earth already, until we're gone. Verse 4, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now keep in mind, Paul is writing this in 51 AD. A few short years later, the temple's destroyed. Remember, Titus Vespasian, it burns down to the ground. Once that occurs, man, oh my gosh, Paul had just been decapitated by the Romans a few years earlier. So at that point, the church should have come to an end because, wow, the prophecy about the temple being desecrated by Antichrist going into it and calling himself God, that can't be fulfilled because they destroyed the temple in 70 AD. So everybody should have quit Christianity and it should have disappeared and been replaced by Islam or whatever. But that's not what happened. Why? Because we know that if the Bible says something's going to happen, God has to make it happen. And if he can speak the universe into existence, he can go out of his way to have a third temple rebuilt, which we are going to see happening, I would predict. Probably, if you were doing an over and under, like in sports betting, I don't do sports betting, but if you did, if there was an over and under regarding 5 years, is it more likely that the temple will be rebuilt in less than 5 years or more than 5 years? I would suggest take the under, because I'm pretty sure it's going to be less than 5 years. And I'd say it's more likely that it'll be rebuilt within the next 5 years than more than 5 years from now. So that's what I would suggest to you, and we see that happening, and that would have to happen because in 70 AD, on the 9th day of Av, which is going to be commemorated in just a few hours at sundown, we're going to see the 9th of Av is commemorating that destruction of the second temple. And so since the second temple was destroyed, it can be rebuilt, just like the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC and it was rebuilt. So what we know then is that God can superintend over space, time, and history to do these things. And as we see news coming on a daily basis about preparations for the rebuilding of the temple, we know then that the rapture can occur at any moment. Is it going to occur on September 23rd of this year? I can't say with absolute certainty, and nobody can say with absolute certainty. Is it likely to happen in 2025? Probably, if that passage about 2,000 years being 2 days, and Jesus, we know from Artaxerxes Longimanus and Sir Robert Anderson's The Coming Prince mathematical computations, that crucifixion and resurrection occurred in the spring of 32 AD, so 2,000 years from that gives you 2032 AD. But then you have that 70th week of Daniel from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. That means you have to roll the clock back to get the church out of there at the very least 7 years ahead of 2032, which means we only have about 5 months left, if that's correct, to do your street preaching, your evangelizing, talking to your loved ones, talking to strangers about Jesus, talking to anybody about Jesus will get you a reward in heaven that you will be able to accept and be able to enjoy forever at that Bema Seat judgment when rewards are going to be handed out for all the good things you did for Jesus. So with the time remaining, man, keep looking up because we are at the end of the times. TISHA B'AV, let's keep in mind as the church that Israel went through a time of suffering because they were being disciplined, but God loved them and he's going to be faithful to them and he's going to come back to them. He's going to rebuild that temple for them, and then Antichrist will come and imitate that, and that will be the thing that triggers the second coming of Jesus Christ to the earth to take over the world and become enthroned as the King of Israel 1,260 days later. So with the time we have remaining, as we always say, keep looking up, for our redemption is drawing nigh. And maybe we only have 5 more months of that drawing nigh until it's all over.